Okay, I wanted to publish one final chapter from this 2017 anthology, Human Origins, that I feel sort of succinctly ties together certain elements of the series. Again, I think the first 5 episodes were really focused on getting into the core of human culture and what it is. And then the episodes since then have been sort of later chapter by chapter elaborations from the same text that put it into more of a ethnographic context, the insights that we found. And Ian Watt's chapter is in that vein. So, Ian Watts is an independent researcher living in Athens. He's been publishing on the early record of pigment use in southern Africa for 20 years, integrating the insights gleaned into evolutionary accounts of ritual and symbolic culture. More occasionally, he's also published on aspects of African hunter-gatherer cosmology. And so, we're talking about rain serpents in northern Australia and southern Africa, asking the question whether they have a common ancestry, which is very provocative, obviously. So we were looking at previously like reconstructing elements of an African, like a source cosmology among African hunter-gatherers. And this essay is sort of pointing to a commonality of a particular symbolic category, namely rain serpents, um, that may be not only within one continent, but across very diverse human cultures. So I won't say too much about it. I simply want to get into it and allow Ian Watts to speak for himself. And like importantly, there was a lot of focus in both episode 6 and 8 in this series on the eland, which is a like an antelope-like creature in on the grasslands of Africa. And here, Ian Watts is going to discuss why that eland is sort of in a symbolic category, which is shared with the rain serpent. And so he's going to explain that himself. He also gives an introduction that I feel like is a good summary of many of the other essays in the book. What he's going to then do is like present a background on rainbow serpents in Australia, and then draw from different aspects of Bushman cosmology from Africa that makes this connection between the eland and snakes, and then draw that together into some discussion and conclusion. So it's going to be quite clear at the beginning. It's going to get a little bit complex, and then hopefully come together, which is pretty normal at this point. So, rain serpents in northern Australia and southern Africa, a common ancestry, by Ian Watts. Introduction. In the late 1980s, geneticists announced that we evolved in Africa close to 200,000 years ago, with tentatively inferred initial migration between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago. Paleolithic archaeologists immediately recognized that these findings made the long-established consensus that there was no compelling evidence for symbolic behaviors predating 40,000 years ago look decidedly anomalous. How could the fundamental trait distinguishing our species from earlier hominins post-date our dispersal? New research in Africa was initiated, as a result of which it is now widely accepted that symbolic culture was in place by 100,000 years ago. The evidence includes habitual use of red ochre, closely associated with the dispersal, geometric engravings on ochre, beads with ochre residues, and in the Levant, male burials with parts of game animals, indirectly associated with ochre. In southern Africa, the most intensively studied portion of the continent for the relevant period, it seems that ubiquitous use of red ochre can be inferred from 170,000 years ago, suggesting that symbolic culture correlates with our speciation. Use of red and glittery pigments in southern Africa from 500,000 years ago has been interpreted as the earliest evidence for collective ritual. At first sight, a speculative case might be made for a gradual evolution of collective ritual, out of which was forged a template of symbolic culture. at least three elements of which might be inferred by the time of dispersal beyond Africa, namely belief in other worlds, associating the dead with game animals, cosmetic skin change, and some form of blood symbolism. Okay, so what is he saying here? So they were sort of asking, like, if we came out of Africa, um, you know, only 100,000 to 50,000 years ago, why didn't we already have symbolic culture? And it seems like we did. Like they thought that symbols and symbolic culture evolved much more recently, but then they pushed that date back to around 100,000 years ago, which went along with our move out of Africa. And it seemed that this connection between symbolic culture and red ochre went along with the speciation of our species from other species while we were still in Africa. And has also been interpreted that presence of red ochre, which goes back to about 500,000 years, is interpreted as evidence for collective ritual, which is quite old. And then they're saying, okay, this evidence of collective ritual is a kind of template of symbolic culture itself, which predated our dispersal, and was sort of again symbolic of our speciation. It represented our speciation, and that it was composed this evolution of collective ritual out of three key elements, namely a belief in other worlds, quote unquote other worlds, this connection with the dead and game animals that kind of go together, and also with cosmetic skin changing, or this is connected with the theriomorphism, changing into animals, and also some form of blood symbolism. So these are kind of common elements. Okay, he goes on. For reasons concerning the history of the discipline, social anthropologists have been slow to respond to the possible implications of our recent dispersal out of Africa. Among the first to do so was Alan Barnard, who made a case for why Bushmen, rather than Australian Aborigines, are more appropriate for thinking about early human society. Bushmen from Africa, that is. He identified six key areas of difference where parsimony suggested that this was the case. Essentially, that the Australian worldview was too structurally evolved. Within the field of belief, he considered that Australian Aborigines differed from all other modern hunter-gatherers in their belief of the rainbow serpent and the dreaming. He went on to note, quote, although rainbow serpent-type creatures feature too in African mythology and rock art, they do not carry this symbolic weight, and that there's no African equivalent to the dreaming. The dreaming is a parallel but ontologically prior world, where the distinction between animals and humans is not fixed. Other Bushman specialists do see an equivalence, so Barnard's assertion is debatable. Regarding rainbow serpent type creatures, a more interesting issue than their relative symbolic weight in the two regions is the implicit question about the nature of the identity. Like, what is the rainbow serpent type creature? And whether it's the same in these different places, whether rather than asking why does it have such different symbolic weight in different places and how much that difference might be, well, why is there any similarity at all? Why is there a connection? And whether that should be attributed to trivial or non-trivial factors. Okay, he goes on. Wait, hang on. I should just say from there, like, what he's connecting is that um, we talked about these like common elements of culture that were very old, sorry, in their collective ritual practice. They had to do with this belief in other worlds, cosmetic skin change, and some form of blood symbolism. And we're going to explore how this is connected with the symbolic significance of the rainbow serpent as found in Australia and Africa. So that's what we're looking into. Now he continues. Rainbow serpent type creatures are representative of the wider set of dragons, serpents, and rain animals, widely distributed in world mythology. The set has primarily been based on a number of recurrent themes, prominent among which have been control of water, an intimate relationship to women, transformative power, including death, healing, and resurrection, movement between worlds, and an antithesis to cooking, and also an antithesis to exogamous sex or marriage, which basically means that the symbolic set associated with this rainbow serpent type creature is sort of um, when the ritual behavior that manifests the presence of the spirit occurs, cooking is not on the agenda, and neither is like exogamous sex, as in sleeping around, is also um, not a good idea, as in not not on the menu, not indicated by the presence of this particular symbolic category. Initially, building on an earlier theological research agenda, Dean, uh, wait, no, sorry, this is referring to a particular author named Dean, and referring to the focus of their research, which is that attention is focusing on serpent worship in state societies. Quote, even as the scope of inquiry broadened, it remained a search for fixed meanings. Right. A notable exception was Vladimir Prop's formalist approach, which recognized that all magical tales were uniquely constrained, and he concluded that Eurasian fairy tales could be treated as variants of one tale only, in which a dragon kidnaps a princess. Only with the influence of structuralism in the 1970s did researchers begin to focus on the underlying logic informing such supernatural beings. So essentially, he's saying, hey, let's look deeper rather than looking at the different sort of um, maybe surface level differences in this kind of comparative mythology. What is the underlying logic that sort of presupposes these supernatural beings, such as serpents, dragons, rain animals? So that's what he's wanting to focus on. We're still in the introduction here. Quote, Radcliffe Brown, 1926, first noted possible parallels between Australian rainbow snakes and Bushman belief in snakes protecting waterholes, but without comment or citing any African literature. The issue remained dormant until a preliminary treatment by Knight in 1991, drawing on rock art studies and limited ethnographic material to compare the logic of belief with that he had identified in greater detail in Australia. In the most recent and exhaustive evaluation of Khoisan rainbow snake-type creatures, Sullivan and Lowe end by quoting Knight's conclusion about Australian rainbow snake myths. To give the full quote, quote, what all these myths are referring to is not really a thing at all, but a cyclical logic which lies beyond and behind all the many concrete images. Moon, snakes, tidal forces, waterholes, rainbows, mothers, and so on, used in partial attempts to describe it. Sullivan and Lowe's own conclusion is that Khoisan material affirms in all its detail and particularity the broad contours of this logic. So something about this symbolic set is going together and we don't understand why. It's a kind of cyclicality. Again, it's the Ouroboros, right? It's this connection between the moon, snakes, tidal forces, waterholes, rainbows, and mothers. So there's a kind of a symbolic and cultural significance to this, which is we've been unclear about. Okay, sorry about that. So I am back, and we were talking about a kind of cyclical logic, a certain symbolic category connected with the term Ouroboros, namely the rainbow serpent, rain serpents, moons, snakes, tidal forces, waterholes, rainbows, mothers, and so on. So, quote, so what is this cyclical logic? Knight had proposed a model of the origin of symbolic culture in which evolving women, faced with the costs of giving birth to and rearing larger-brained, more dependent offspring, needed to secure unprecedented levels of male investment. To achieve this, they had, through collective ritual action, made themselves periodically sexually unavailable, declaring themselves sacred and taboo. until men surrendered the product of a collective hunt. This was achieved through exploiting the signaling potential of menstruation. It goes on, but I'm just like highlighting this as a really important passage here, showing how um like it's talking about the origins of symbolic culture. It's saying that these women, as women were evolving, they were having to give birth to these children who were increasingly costly to give birth to, right? Because our brains were so big and we needed so much investment to raise us to the level of adulthood. And they needed to get men involved in the process of child rearing. And that they did that through collective ritual action in which they made themselves periodically sexually unavailable. They became sacred and taboo until men contributed um, by, for example, bringing back food that the group could eat. And they did that by exploiting the signaling potential of menstruation. The evolutionary logic was more precisely specified by Knight, Watts, and Power in 1995, who identified menstruation as a valuable cue to males of imminent fertility. So menstruation indicates when there's fertility. So the posited strategy was that the most reproductively burdened females prevented would-be philanderer males from targeting an imminently fertile menstruant at the expense of other females, forming a picket line around her, sharing the blood around, or using blood substitutes to scramble the information, thereby using cultural or cosmetic means to synchronize bleeding, while at the same time advertising her attractive qualities. So this is a way for like women worked as a collective. They worked in solidarity so that men essentially couldn't pick on any one woman. And so like where the signal is a very ancient evolutionary signal of menstruation is connected with fertility. And the idea of collective ritual action by women is to dilute that information across the group so that men would not be able to pick on any one person. Um, Goran, these female cosmetic coalitions inverted standard fertility signaling, ritually pantomiming wrong species, wrong sex, wrong time. The economic logic was the imposition of a rule of distribution, dissociating people from their own produce, whether the product of hunting labor or reproductive labor. So what is this? This is about like egalitarianism and sharing, right? So the idea here is that through this collective ritual action, men are discouraged from saying, "Hey, that's my food." They're encouraged to share with the group, right? So that's the product of hunting labor, right? But also reproductive labor. There's also incest prohibitions by the same kind of logic, dissociating people from their own produce through use of yeah, sacred and taboo categories connected with blood. So as it said, the economic logic was the imposition of a rule of distribution, dissociating people from their own produce, whether the product of hunting labor or reproductive labor. Synchronizing strike action across communities required an environmental cue of appropriate periodicity. So how did they synchronize this kind of that strike action? Right? Well, collective spear hunting of medium to large game, liable to take several days and nights, needed to optimize available natural light, making the days and nights immediately before the full moon ideal, implying that the strike began at the dark moon. So this is why this connection with the periodicity of the moon, that it's related to hunting behavior based on the availability of light. The cyclical logic is the movement from blood-defined kinship. Sorry, the cyclical logic is the movement from blood-defined kinship solidarity to honeymoon, or from temporary death to marital relations to the resurrection of those marital relations, and from ritual power on to ritual power off. Does that make sense? It's quite a tricky thing to grasp, but it's saying like there's a periodicity or a cyclical logic which is tied into not only the cycles of the moon, but also the cycles of whether we're doing the ritual or whether we're living in our normal life. So whether we're living in our normal marital life, for example, or whether that's temporarily switched off, as in temporary death and then resurrection of normal marital relations. There's also this, yeah, it's a periodical transition from kinship, which is defined by blood, to kinship, which is more defined by, so as I was saying, the cyclical logic is the movement from blood-defined kinship solidarity to honeymoon, and from temporary death to marital relations to resurrection of those marital relations, and from ritual power on to ritual power off. So what goes on? If lack of meat motivates the sex strike, it should also be a cooking strike. And if women's blood marks them as periodically taboo, then killed and bloody game animals should also be taboo until they're surrendered and the blood removed through cooking. Treating metaphor as the underlying principle of symbolic culture, the fundamental metaphor is that women's blood be equated with that of game animals. What kind of phenomena might be suitable for elaborating the logic informing this metaphor? Anything that could represent periodicity, movement between worlds, associated with wetness, ambiguous sex, minimal morphological differentiation, whatever that means, skin change, and transformative powers would be appropriate. Rainbows meet some of these requirements, and for a tropically evolved species, pythons would also be particularly good to think with. Okay, so what is this saying? So there's this like deep symbolic association, right? It's quite ancient that has to do with the sacredness and taboo of blood. It was derived from female collective ritual action that had to do with prohibition on certain forms of activity, like selfish activity, um, that encouraged sharing, egalitarianism generally, right? And it had to do with this rhythmic or periodical association with the moon. So again, there's like the tie between menstrual cycles and the cycles of the moon that like they're not necessarily perfect, right? But when we can see that it's connected with hunting logic, then we see why certain rituals are invoked at certain times. And so the idea was that women needed to encourage men to contribute more to the group, and that they did that by essentially going on strike. Hey, we're not available for sex, and it's also a cooking strike. Hey, we're not going to cook anything because you need to go and hunt it. And so there was a connection with the blood that was marking taboo and sacredness. So, so then the question is, this was the like the original and deepest symbolic association, the as if the metaphorical leap that we saw in, for example, episode 6 in this series, this connection between women's blood and animal blood. So the idea is that there would be a certain phenomena, a symbolic complex that informs that metaphor, that explains why is there this connection between animal blood and menstrual blood. And the idea is that the symbolic complex that uh, inform that connection in the way that Ian Watts is going to draw out is connected with some of the details, the qualities that we've been talking about, such as periodicity, such as movement between worlds, such as quote, association with wetness, ambiguous sex, minimal morphological differentiation, skin change, and transformative powers. So what he's saying is that the rainbow serpent and rain serpents worldwide are going to be connected to this symbolic category that has to do with the association with women's blood and menstrual blood, or at least is a candidate for that. And so this leads to his suggestion of what he's going to do. And so he's tying together all of the different, or many of the different arguments from the book into something coherent. And he says, in this chapter, I compare aspects of Yulungur, the Yolngu rainbow snake of Arnhem Land in northern Australia, and Kwa, the rain bull of the Sam Bushman. It says XAM, I don't know how to pronounce that. XAM, Sam Bushman in the Upper Karoo in South Africa. So he's comparing a rainbow snake with a rain bull in Northern Australia and Southern Africa, respectively. And following night, he focuses on the relationship of these supernatural beings to menstrual blood, hoping to show how this throws their logic and structural role into sharpest relief. Okay, so that was the conclusion of the introduction. And so he now goes into the background, which is drawing from the Australian part. And so he's said what he's going to do. It now gets a little bit difficult to follow because of the language. So let's see how we go. So this section is called background. The study of rainbow snakes in Australia can be divided into two main phases. An initial period, identifying and describing the phenomena in the late 1920s, and structuralist influenced work in the 1970s and early 1980s. Some Aboriginal cultures permitted relating the mythological entity to ritual practice. The second phase recognized that the rainbow snake as perhaps the ultimate symbolic representation of paradox and transformation. So there's a particular connection here between this mythological entity, the rainbow serpent, ritual practice, and the phenomena of paradox and transformation. The Yolngu live in northeast Arnhem Land in the Australian tropics. Seasonal flooding and a difficult landscape made the area unattractive to Europeans, allowing the Yolngu to keep their culture relatively intact well into the 20th century. The myth of how, as a result of the actions of the two Wawalak sisters, Yolngu created the present world, is the most extensively recorded and thoroughly analyzed of Australian rainbow snake myths. So Watts is going to present an abridged version of a particular story, the story of the two Wawalak sisters. It's a myth, and it's a myth of how Yolngu, or the rainbow serpent, uh, created the present world. It's presented in a way such that it is representative of other similar myths that are not exactly the same, but are similar. That's the Australian bit. And then he says, a history of research on Khoisan rainbow serpent type creatures in southern Africa is beyond the scope of this paper. Suffice it to say that they have been indigenously described as, quote, water snakes, great snakes, eland bulls, rain bulls, and indeterminate large quadrupeds. Such creatures are considered to lie at the heart of a dynamic assemblage of extant or currently existing cognitive associations between snakes, rain, environmental or landscape dynamics, water, fertility, blood, fat, transformation, dance, and healing. So these things are all connected in a particular symbolic category that we see associated with both water snakes, the eland bull, and rain bulls in South Africa. Okay, he then moves on. The Xam were Bushmen of the Upper Karoo, the interior semi-arid region south of the Orange River. This is still in Africa. But a different group. We're not talking about the Khoisan anymore, we're talking about the Bushmen. So south of the Orange River. Because they were killed or brutally assimilated into the colonial frontier economy of the late 18th and first half of the 19th centuries, virtually everything we know about them is through the remarkable linguistic endeavors of Wilhelm Bleek and his sister-in-law Lucy Lloyd in the 1870s, and the equally remarkable cooperation of a succession of Xam prisoners released into their custody, several of whom stayed well beyond their prison terms. This vast corpus of material included information on ritual and an extensive body of mythology. The myths can be supplemented by Gideon Retief von Huylgief, a particular researcher's Afrikaans narratives, recorded from Xam farm workers in the 1880s. Well, Ainsley Hoff's salvage anthropology among contemporary descendants of the Xam provides valuable fragmentary details concerning ritual and belief. So there's converging evidence for this that talks about the Bushman, which is a different, again, different group in Africa. And then he says, linguistically, the Xam belong to the southern group of three Khoisan language families. I see. So we're looking at the group of African hunter-gatherers currently extant that is called Khoisan that belong to different linguistic groups, and the Xam, Bushmen, are a subset of those, namely the southern group of three different Khoisan language families. That's helpful. There's considerable overlap in beliefs between historically pastoralist co-speaking cultures and historically hunter-gatherer Bushmen co and San speakers. So this is saying there's a lot of overlap in beliefs between the pastoralist and the hunter-gatherers. Bushman religion is best characterized in terms of fluidity and ambiguity, both within and between linguistic groups. But menarcheal ritual and healing dances, again, menarcheal is associated with the first menstrual cycle, but menarcheal ritual and healing dances are remarkably uniform in their performative structure and associated beliefs. Both, again, menarcheal ritual and healing dances, are means of entering into what the Juhoan call first creation, which is in some way equivalent to the dreaming, where the distinction between animals and people is not fixed. Okay, again, this menarcheal ritual and healing dances as means of entering into first creation was discussed in detail in the last episode. But the connection to the rainbow serpent and the symbolic complex in this, the sort of equivalent symbolic complex in Africa is what Watts is wanting to focus on. And to get to that aspects of the Bushman's cosmology, he starts talking, first of all, he goes over this myth from the indigenous Australians, which we were talking about a bit. It's the myth of the Wawilak sisters, which is supposed to be representative in some way. So now it tells this story, which isn't that long. And again, it had to do with the creation of the world by a rainbow serpent named Yulungur and its connection to the symbolism associated with menstrual blood. So the Wawilak sisters. This summary is largely taken from Warner, 1958. Two Dreamtime sisters of the Dua moiety, the elder carrying a baby boy, the younger pregnant, are crossing the land. They carry stone-tipped spears, bush cotton, and hawk's down. During their travels, they kill iguana, opossum, and bandicoot, giving them the names they bear today, saying that they will become sacred, and in the meantime, putting them in their dilly bags. The younger sister gives birth during their travels. They intend to circumcise the boys. They meet classificatory brothers and have sex with them. They finally arrive at the big waterhole near the coast. Miramina, snake swallows, or Djurima, menstruation blood, is the name of this big waterhole. The older sister tries to cook the animals they've caught, but each time one is placed on the fire, it comes back to life and jumps into the waterhole. A drop of her menstrual blood falls into the water. In another version, this pollution is ascribed to the younger sister and occurs before the animals are placed on the fire. In any case, lying at the bottom of the waterhole, Yulungur, also of the Dua moiety, smells the blood and rises to the surface, drawing the water level up with him or her. With him or her. again, so this Yulunga is a rainbow snake, spiritual, deific, deified spiritual creature or mythological entity. And in this cosmology, there are moieties or uh, classification groups that are like it's a kind of totemic kinship structure between animals and humans. And so it so happens that these two Dreamtime sisters are in the same quote dua moiety as Yulunga, and he can smell the menstrual blood, and he uh, is neither gender, he's both him or her, and he basically in this mythology creates the flooding, the seasonal flooding that is local to that region, right? So it says. Lying at the bottom of the waterhole, Yulunga, also of the Dua moiety, smells the blood and rises to the surface, drawing the water level up with him or her, the seasonal flooding that's such a determinant factor to life in Arnhem He spits water into the air to become a small black cloud. The sisters, alarmed by the growing cloud that came from nowhere, start to sing and dance, performing increasingly sacred songs. In some versions, the younger sister starts to bleed. It is at this point that he entrances them, licks them, bites their noses to make them bleed, swallows them alive, and rises up into the sky, where he's joined by other snakes, all of the Dua moiety, each speaking a different language. Regretting their different tongues, Yulunga calls upon them to sing out together, making an unprecedented noise and creating a common ceremony. Confronted over his incestuous cannibalism, because he ate women from his same moiety, he regurgitates the sisters and their children onto an anthill to dry. They are revived by Yulunga's trumpet and the biting ants. The swallowing and regurgitation are repeated, but only the sisters are regurgitated again, not their sons, because it's legitimate to consume flesh of the opposite moiety, the sons. And Yulunga finally returns the sisters to Wawalak country. Meanwhile, two Wawalak men saw the lightning and heard the thunder accompanying all this commotion, and tracked the sisters to Miramina, which is the waterhole where they were, where they find their blood and scoop it up, gather the hawks down and bush cotton, and fall asleep. The sisters appear in their dreams and recount everything that happened, instructing them in the songs and how to perform male circumcision ceremonies. They sang Yulunga and Moit, another name for Yulunga, which is apparently songs about those deities, and it says, quote, "You must dance all the things we saw and named on our journey, and which ran away into the well," which was a little bit complicated, but that is the end of the story of the Wawalak sisters. And then Watts has to say about that. The myth of the Wawalak sisters is reenacted in various male initiation rituals, notably the interclan Tjungguan ritual, when boys are circumcised. The day before, initiated men are blown over by the Yulunga trumpet and produce arm blood to hold the hawks down and bush cotton on the dancers' bodies and the Moit emblems. That night, the neophytes are shown the snake for the first time. Two padded poles, quote, with rock pythons painted in blood on white surfaces, gleaming in the light of the many fires. The men say they stole this power from women. As an informant told Warner, quote, the cycle of the seasons with the growth and decay of plants, copulation, birth, and death of animals, as well as men, is all the fault of those two Wawalak sisters. If they hadn't done wrong in their own country and copulated with Duawonga men, and then come down to the Lialeomir country and menstruated and made that snake wild, this cycle would never have occurred. Okay, so this was a mythological story from the uh, of the Wawalak sisters from the Yolngu people of Northeast Arnhem Land in the Australian tropics, which presents a myth of the rainbow serpent. And it's connected with um, obviously the sort of breaking of the taboo boundaries by these two Wawalak sisters, and how men then stole a certain ritual power from those women and used that in their male initiation rituals. Again, rather complicated. What we're hoping to get at is the cross-cultural similarities in the qualities of these rainbow serpents. And in that vein, that's what allows Watts to move on from this myth, which is basically background to our understanding, and talk about aspects of Bushman cosmology. Again, now we're going from Australia over to Africa. And this section, aspects of Bushman cosmology, has two different subsections. First is called Eland and Snakes, and the second is called Bushman Menarcheal Ritual. And so first of all, he says, before turning to Bushman myths bearing on rainbow serpent type creatures, comment is needed on the connection between eland and snakes, and on the place of menarche, again, the initial menstruation cycle, in Bushman cosmology. So this is what he's wanting to draw out. He's taking this Australian stuff and then connecting it over to these African myths. And to do that, he needs to draw out this connection between the eland and the snakes, which I talked a little bit about previously. And so he says, the eland, the largest and fattest of African antelope, has been described as the Bushman animal de passage, animal of passage. The connection with snakes has largely been ethically derived. That mean ethically, as in from an outsider's quote unquote objective viewpoint when studying a culture, behavior, or language, which is contrasted with an emic perspective. So etic and emic, where emic is an insider's quote unquote subjective viewpoint. So the different approaches within social anthropology or anthropology generally. So quote an etic approach from a more objective, quote unquote objective viewpoint approaches it analyzes data from an external scientific perspective, sometimes using standardized measurements or comparing different cultures to find general rules, whereas emic is more from within. Yeah, and has to do with internal meaning, internal knowledge, and contexts. So basically, that's probably the direction we're hoping to go. And so that helps us clarify what he means here when he says the connection with snakes has largely been ethically derived, which is maybe somewhat unfortunate. Drawing primarily on rock art and interpretation of the testimony of King, who is a bushman of the Maloti Mountains in Lesotho, to Joseph Orton in 1873. Okay, but there are then other accounts. Sorry, basically what we're going into is what is the connection between the eland and the snakes? And he's giving the oldest evidence for this. That was the testimony of this guy. But then he's about to present more evidence for that. And so he goes into that and says, when apparently explaining a painted scene in one of the rock shelters they'd visited, King referred to a large quadruped being charmed out of the water by Bushman as a snake. So that's like, what is this guy talking about? Why is there this connection between the eland bull and the snake? So then what says, explicit emic support consisted of little more than two ethno-historical accounts of Sotho and Nama co-pastoralist beliefs that a snake resided in the red forelock of the eland. Okay, so there's a particular account from co-pastoralists in Southern Africa that gave that recounted a certain belief that a snake actually lives in the forelock of the eland. Okay, so that's further corroborating evidence, and then he goes on more. So then he says, a third 19th century account, previously unremarked, suggests that the belief extended further east, to the Swazi and or Zulu. Vinicom implied that this was also a Bushman belief, something only recently confirmed by Lowe in the among the High Om. Okay, so what can Lowe tell us here? Lowe adds an insight that helps us explain the association. A Juhon Bushman described to me that the eland and the python are the same. The eland gets that fat from the python into him. It just comes with the wind. Lowe interprets this as implying an ontological primacy of the python over the eland. Python fat, in addition to being symbolically potent, is physiologically so. Okay, so this was summarizing some evidence for a um, ancient and symbolic relationship between the eland bull and the rainbow serpent, or the python, in this context. And now it's wanting to go into this a little bit more. Why is this connect like why is there this belief that a snake is hiding in the the red forelock of the eland? It has to do with its potency. Again, this is quite arcane, but I'm going to read it out. It says, similarly, the eland's red forelock is particularly appropriate for symbolizing eland potency. Bulls rub their forelocks in their own urine, and forelock size provides a reliable agnostic signal in intermale competition. The forelock is thought to provide the model for the red pigment motif painted on the brow of the Juhuan Menarcheal girl, and again at marriage. A boy paints the same pattern on himself using ash when he has shot his first eland. A later collective part of this initiation ritual involves lighting a medicine fire by the forelock, so that in future encounters the boy's face will be brilliant, causing the eland's face to split. The Juhuan term for brilliance in this context is identical or very similar to the Xam term for glittery specularite. Given the linguistic distance between the two cultures, this suggests an ancient ritual substrate and associated constructs informing etymology. Okay, what's he saying here? He's saying that there's a particular pattern that connects this the quote red forelock of the eland, and it's the potency of that creature with initiation rituals that connected with hunting. So when a boy shoots his first eland, then he rubs the ash with a particular stone, specularite, which glitters in a color that represents the power of the uh, eland's forelock, apparently. And this suggests, because this is taken from two quite different cultures linguistically, it suggests there's an ancient ritual substrate there. Okay, one final paragraph on this stuff, which says, moreover, for Bushmen of the Maloti Mountains, Lewis Williams has proposed an etymological link between another term for specular hematite, namely Kang Kang, and the trickster named Kang. So there's a connection between this quality of brilliance, or like literally being like bright, glittery, associated with a particular like ash drawn from a particular stone, apparently, and like that quality that has an etymological link to the trickster. So he says, like the snake in the forelock, Kang also sits between the horns of the eland, protecting his favorite animal from hunters. He says, I suggest that the eland's red forelock was the original form of the brilliant blaze, light, glistening stone, or diamond on the brow of the water snake or rain bull. In any event, the forelock is a symbolic nexus, bringing together the potency of eland and snakes, adolescent male and female initiates, redness and brilliance, as well as Kwa and Kang, who are these different figures representing the rainbow serpent. Okay, so that's over. So that section had to do with uncovering an ancient connection between the eland bull and the snakes, which had to do with this a symbolic complex or symbolic nexus that had to do with the potency associated with the forelock of the eland, which had some, mm, well, there are many different qualities that went along with it, but I'm not going to dwell on that. We're in aspects of the Bushman cosmology here that had to do with the connection between eland and snakes, and we're now moving on to the next section, which is much shorter, and it says it's about Bushman monarchical ritual. And it says, an alternative Juhoan phrase for first menstruation is she has shot an eland. Okay, again, already what could this mean? So this is connection between the first menstruation of a girl, her natural initiation, if you like, into womanhood, and also hunting prowess. So why? Why is there this connection? The eland bull is one of the most widespread features of Bushman menarcheal ritual. At the first sign of blood, the girl is sequestered by older female kin, and all the women of the band pantomime eland courtship behavior. She is paradoxically identified with the eland bull and as a hunter, an epitome of wrong species, wrong sex, wrong time. Her food is restricted, but she bestows the benefit of fatness. She must be kept away from water, but she controls water. After the girl's emergence from seclusion, timed in relation to the moon, ritual acts performed often included a reintroduction to water. Or she must be taken through a symbolic shower of rain. Where reintroduced to a water source, this may be personified as a rain bull or a water snake. She's believed to help to ensure fertilizing soft female rain and success in forthcoming hunts. In this last capacity, both the overall ritual and specific acts upon her emergence can be seen as a Bushman counterpart to Pygmy women's ritual hunting labor. Okay, what does this mean? So this is talking about initiation ceremonies among the Bushmen that had to do with when young women menstruate for the first time. And it went into like some of what happens. Basically, the older female kin take her away, and it has to do with this identification that she's like a powerful hunter, but she's also identified with that which she has hunted. I drew this out last time that there's a way that um monarchical power, there's a kind of spiritual power or shamanic power associated with uh the initial menstruation. And that's kind of equivalent to hunting prowess, but it's like spiritual hunting, not real hunting. And so what I um drew together was that on a ritual occasion like that, she this initiate um assumes the identity of her own soul. So in Jung, that would be the animus, which is like a male persona, right? Where is in a man, the soul would be the anima, which is a female um, figure. Again, that's just one example of many ways of understanding this. But so the idea would be that in that ritual context, she assumes the identity of her own soul, namely her animus, and shoots or captures the spirit of the animal in from that perspective, from the perspective of her own soul. And that in a way captures or gives access to um, possession by that spirit. And so there's a way that the girl both captures that spirit and becomes that spirit. So this has to do with possession. And so this could be approached in the language of hunting or with sexuality, I would say. Again, this had to do with female and male reproduction, and there's a connection between hunting and penetration, where basically this girl is um, in a what would I say? There's clearly a deep connection between this girl on the time of this monarchical ritual and the spirit that she's in deep connection with. And whether that be a connection that's based on hunting and capturing or on sexuality is ambiguous. But in either way, she uh, becomes essentially the epitome of wrong species, wrong sex, wrong time. It's really, really important here that her ritual power on that occasion provided access for the whole group to access this kind of like original time, this uh, this space of mythical, mystical participation that was important in renewing their culture. But it was also that, yeah, it's a transformation in the identity. So from a available female human, she becomes a unavailable male animal, and then there are symbolic power associated with that that has to do with ensuring fertilization and soft female rain and success in forthcoming hunts. So this ritual behavior was connected with natural cycles. Okay, that was a bit complicated. There's one more paragraph here, and that was among the Juhuan, which is a they're among the Bushmen, and the Xam are more Bushmen, but they're not the Juhuan, so a slightly different group. And it says. The Xam guardian of menstrual observances was Kwa, the rain bull or rain animal, who sometimes appeared as a bull eland. Kwa was also the term for water, rain, and at least in one instance, menstrual blood. Kwa dwells in waterholes and controls lightning, thunder, whirlwinds, and rain. He's strongly attracted by the scent of the girl, which is given as an explanation for her seclusion, and also the extensive use of buchu, an aromatic bush, which paradoxically both arouses and pacifies Kwa, and is used to raise and calm energy or potency as required in context. Buchu may mask the smell of the blood, but by association it may also be indexical of blood. The menstrual hut was referred to as the house of trembling, which has been connected with the somatic experience of trance, the potency in both contexts being essentially identical. Upon her emergence, the new maiden sprinkled buchu and red ochre on the waterhole in current use, reintroducing herself to Kwa. Okay, I won't comment on that. I'm simply going to leave that be. Again, it was quite complicated. We were talking about aspects of the Bushman cosmology. Firstly, we dwelt on the connection between eland and snakes, and secondly, on this Bushman monarchical ritual among different groups. And so we're now moving from the cosmology to talk about the Bushman myths. And again, it's still difficult. The first section is called The Smell of the Girl's Blood Conjures Kwa, which is another tale. And it says the following exam tales of girls at Menarche can be compared with the Australian material. So again, we talked about an Australian story earlier about the Warlock sisters, and we're now going to compare this tale from the exam of girls also at Menarche. So the story goes as follows. The rain, capital R, rain, the rain formerly courted a young woman while the young woman was in her hut because she was still ill on account of her blood, either postpartum or menstrual. The rain scented her and went forth on account of it. As the rain came forth, it became misty. He trotted up to her hut and courted the young woman on account of her scent. And she lay, smelling the rain scent, and the place was fragrant. She rode away on the rain bull, but rather than be taken down into the waterhole, she put him to sleep with Butcher, so she could return to her child and kin. A menarcheal girl who had not yet been reintroduced to the water and still had the smell of butchu on her, went into the veld to dig for bulbs against her mother's advice. She saw a quote, little waft of mist, but ignored it. Next time she looked up, it had become a great cloud directly overhead, covering the whole sky like a beast of prey. She dropped her bag and ran for home, but too late. The lightning cleaved the ground, and the earth ascended with the maiden. It became a whirlwind. The maiden's mother, seeing this from the camp, spoke, "You see the earth rising over there. It rises from the place where Kwa struck. It rises over there. It is the earth." The maiden truly became dust, while she felt that she was a snake. Whirling, she ascended, and the sorcerers sang, "Kwa is now the one who takes her away. She becomes a snake." Lucy Lloyd noted that the narrator, Giaquain, said that this was a large snake whose name was feared, as portrayed in the rock art copy sent by George Stowe to Wilhelm Bleek. The snake was known as Keten. Okay, that's the end of the story. I want to mention here that the connection here is that uh, basically, upon the occasion of the first menstrual cycle, it seems that there are specific ritual observances that have to be practiced, and whether they are practiced or not, this was a story about when they're not practiced, has a determining effect on whether um, the girl is possessed by the spiritual deity that is in their cosmology, or whether she captures that deity. So when the ritual is performed correctly, then she is regarded as a kind of powerful hunter who captured the eland bull and was able to theriomorphically embody or access the power associated with that hunting prowess. But in this story that we just read, she was ignorant and ignored her initial menstrual cycle and was then possessed by Kwa, the rainbow serpent. Okay, two more paragraphs that explain this in Watt's terms. The preliminary manifestation of Kwa as a small but rapidly growing cloud, a small but rapidly growing cloud, is strikingly similar to the preliminary manifestation of Ilungur that was from the Australian myth. But it's the operational identity that is significant. In both cases, the girl's blood conjures the snake from the water and is responsible for her either being swallowed by or morphing into a snake. This is the only point in the Bleak and Lloyd narratives where either Kwa or the monarchical girl is identified with a snake, but it's an identity confirmed by von Willich and by Xam descendants. Okay, so there's a connection here that's, again, broadly cross-cultural. We're talking about this connection between Australian and African mythology, and it has to do with, again, monarchical ritual and the proper observance of that or not in the mythology. And like in both cases, the girl's blood conjures the snake from the water and is responsible for her either being swallowed by or morphing into a snake. And again, I connected this with whether if one correctly observes the ritual observances, ritual practices, then one is capable of becoming a sort of successful hunter in their spirituality by adopting the perspective of one's own soul, I would say. That's one way of understanding it. And when one doesn't do that, then one is possessed by that which one would otherwise have hunted, namely the rainbow serpent. Okay, one final paragraph here, which goes, in recounting this story, heard from his mother, Dear Quain, who's the informant, commented, quote, when she is a maiden, she has the rain's magic power. When she is a maiden, she has the rain's magic power. She is responsible for the redness of the rain, a deep structure in Khoisan cosmology. Paradoxically, the ontological transformation of the new maiden, her entry into first creation, and her ability to take the whole community with her occurs irrespective of whether she complies with or breaches correct behavior. It's only the positive or negative valence of the transformation that changes. It's this same potency that some men and fewer women might train for years to harness as rain shamans, game shamans, or healers. Okay, again, this is super important right here. This is saying that there's a particular nexus of, let's say, spiritual power, something like that, that's connected with the first menstrual cycle of women in uh, Xam culture that is reflected in the Khoisan cosmology, their worldview, their beliefs, their mythology. And so this girl, when she enters into this natural cycle of initiation, let's say, she's ontologically transformed, first of all, and this is this connection from, available female human to unavailable male animal or creature. So she's ontologically transformed. She has access to first creation, which is their version of the dreaming or dream time. This is this, I won't elaborate on what that is. And that actually she can actually take the whole community with her there. And all of those abilities, that capacity that goes along with that time, that occasion, they occur regardless of whether she complies with or breaches the correct behavior. So all of those capacities remain with one. It's just the valence of the transformation that occurs. Either that's experienced as a positive event, and she is a superior hunter who's captured the spirit of the animal or copulated with it, or she's possessed by it, and it's a negative experience. And what's more, it's that same potency they were talk. This is talk, we were talking about that in the connection with gnome. This potency, or yeah, energetic or spiritual potency in the last essay that we were talking about. It's the same potency that people train to access as shamans or healers that the Menarcheal girl has by natural right, you could say. Yeah, and it says, although this could be acquired naturally, it's the new maiden's as of right. It's her right, accorded by a culturally constructed nature. The Kung and the Xam regarded the new maiden to be the source of Nom, the healing potency normally associated with the male trance healers. And so this challenges the use of Bushman ethnography to support the thesis that early religion was shamanistic. It's not only shamanistic, it's also deeply connected with this menstrual cycle, menarcheal cycle specifically. Okay, again, that was a lot to take in. So I'm going to go through the whole thing here. It's not that long to go. So we're in the bit which is about Bushman mythology. We were earlier talking about the cosmology. We talked about the connection between eland and snakes. We talked about the Bushman menarcheal ritual, which had to do with the initiation stuff. We then went into the mythology. We gave an example story that can be compared with the Australian material we were talking about earlier. We then talked about what that means in terms of the symbolic or ritual power that we're talking about. We're now talking about an aspect of it, which is like, why is it against cooking? It has to do with anti-cooking. Why? So this was the stuff about collective female power. They're basically by participating in these rituals as a collective, they're able to say, hey, we're not going to cook at the moment. You need to go out and hunt something. So why about this? Well, it goes into this over a page that includes a couple of different accounts. So anti-cooking, it says, in the Warwick sisters story, this is the Australian story, the fact that the animals come alive upon being placed in the fire can be ascribed to the sisters' bloody state, and to the fact that the sisters had declared that the animals would become sacred totems of the same flesh, the same moiety as themselves. So what does that mean? There's a way that because the sisters were trying to cook at the same time as menstruating, This was connected with the fact that those animals could just come alive, and the fact that they already declared that they would become sacred. So they're kind of breaking taboo boundaries, and that's what gives the animals this ability to come alive when they were actually dead. Because the animals are essentially saying, "Hey, you're breaking all the boundaries. Why are you doing that?" So then it connects. So that was about the Australian story. It then says, the following is another exam myth about a new maiden. Quote, a girl is in her seclusion hut. She peeps out to make sure nobody is about and goes down to the waterhole. Sitting on the bank, she splashes the water. Ripples twirl the water. A water child, resembling a calf, sprang out. She nabbed it, banged it on the head, flung it over her shoulder, and jogged back to camp. There she hastily made a fire, cut up the water child, roasted it, and ate it all. Then she burnt the bones to ashes, tidied up the fire, swept away her footprints, and returned to the house of trembling. This is repeated over several days. On the fifth day, the water child did not come out easily. It was a male, horned rain child. When she had cut it up and placed it on the fire hissed and spluttered. Water came out of the ground, extinguishing the fire, as it felt that Kwah was angry with the girl. A cold whirlwind whisked her up and dropped her into the waterhole as a frog. The same happened to her kin out on the veld, while organic cultural artifacts reverted to their original natural state. Okay, that was a kind of cool story. Hopefully he's going to talk about what it means. He says this is like why it's against cooking, and it's a story that reflects that. That's all he wanted to draw. So he said a second anti-cooking narrative is the only Qua story in the Bleak and Lloyd collection, which is not concerned with monarchical observances. It's quite short, and it says, a man out hunting mistook a manifestation of Qua for an eland and shot it. Later, following the hunting tracks with companions, they found the eland and set about butchering it and cooking the meat. To their consternation, the meat kept disappearing from the fire. They and their temporary shelter were surrounded by water. They were turned into frogs and hopped away. Okay. So now he gives a couple of short paragraphs again on this anti-cooking theme, which are again quite short. He says, there's no obvious reason to take misidentification as the true cause of the misfortune. It seems more likely that Kwa was angered by the attempt to cook eland meat on the hunting ground, rather than being surrendered as the ideal form of bride service. Okay, that didn't really make a whole lot of sense, so we're going to continue. It gives one more, again, referring to this informant king who we were talking about earlier. It says anti-cooking also figured prominently in one of King's narratives. Quote, it's a short one. A young woman arouses the jealousy of the young men in her community by taking up with a mature bachelor. Kwan Kiducha, the son of Kagan, previously spurned by all women, including herself, the young men applied snake fat to the meat the old man was roasting. As he tried to eat the meat, it repeatedly fell out of his mouth, and he bled profusely from the nose. He threw his possessions into the sky and himself into the river, transforming into a snake. Okay, that's a somewhat complicated theme that had to do with this anti-cooking. And again, we were in this section that was about the Bushman mythology and drawing these, yeah, cross-cultural connections between the Australian mythological story that we saw earlier about the Wawalak sisters and these stories of African origin. Okay, there are two sections that follow, which are quite short. They're about periodicity and the snake as new maiden. We're then going to talk slightly about synchronous bleeding before he gets to the discussion, which is also quite short. So we're almost there. So we've talked about this anti-cooking connection in this, yeah, symbolic category or ritual category. Now, why does this have to do with periodicity? It gives a short story to illustrate this. The following plot outline is taken from von Wielig's recording of a exam myth about the creation of the moon. Again, Kagan is a name for the snake here, the rainbow serpent. It says, Kagan made for himself a pair of shoes, but the right shoe chafed his foot, so he instructed his daughter, the hammerkop, to soften it by throwing it into the waterhole. At the bottom of the waterhole, the water snake was enraged by the polluting shoe and causes the water to freeze. When the hammerkop retrieved the shoe, it came out with a piece of ice attached. In turn angered, Kagan threw the icebound shoe into the sky, where it became the moon. Ever since, people had light at night, enabling them to hunt porcupines and to wait for game at waterholes. The jealous sun shot the shining ice with hot arrows, causing it to melt and the moon to die. The people were distraught. The water snake intervened, creating the fountain on the moon, so it would be reborn. Okay, again, that was quite complex, and to me, it's talking about the mythological origins of periodicity in this exam myth. And then he says, whatever else the shoe may signify, it is necessarily dirty and in this sense polluting. The fact that it chafed Kagan's foot suggests that it may have been bloodied. Other versions specify that the shoe was red owing to the dust of the karoo. Blood would probably have been emically inferred. Another of the hammerkop's roles was to inform the water snake if young maids polluted the fountain in any way. The interaction of blood, or the smell of blood, and the water snake is ultimately responsible for lunar periodicity, just as it is responsible for seasonal periodicity in Arnhem Okay, so this is saying that this water snake is again a spiritual deity who's responsible for creating the world, the cosmology, and namely creating the cycle of the moon, and that he did that because of a connection to the smell of blood. I think I'm going to move on here because I've dwelt for too long on this. So briefly on the topic of synchronous bleeding among the different cultural groups, it says, we saw that the myth of the Warlock sisters, again from Arnhem Land in Australia, underwrites Yolngu male initiation, where men bleed together as initiated men in the preparation of ritual paraphernalia and as novitiates undergoing circumcision when they're introduced to Ilungu, the rainbow serpent. And then it says, the template for men's synchronous bleeding was the blood of the Warlock sister who entered the well and aroused Ilungu. And then both sisters were bleeding prior to being swallowed through synchronized menstruation brought on by the dancing of the most sacred dances, and or being bitten on the nose by Yulungu. We also saw how the blood of the new maiden in southern Africa arouses the rain animal or water snake. Okay. He then says, according to Kuntubu, who's the principal informant about healing for the Bisili and for the Kinis, who are researchers, on the occasion of a Juhoan girl's first menstruation, quote, everyone must bleed in order to be assured full entry into first creation. This is achieved by making cuts on the ears of everyone present, with drops of blood falling to the ground. First creation is characterized by constant morphing of identities between animals and people, with no illness or death. The act of naming, or painting the animals, establishing constant forms, is the great turning or second creation. That's quite interesting. It's saying, again, quote, first creation is characterized by constant morphing of identities between animals and people, with no illness and no death. Whereas the act of naming or establishing these constant forms is the great turning or second creation, and the price of establishing these permanent forms was sickness and death. This mythological, this story, it's actually a creation myth, lines up completely with what we were talking about in terms of right and left hemispheres, and in the creation and reclassification of categories in the first 5 episodes of the series, but I won't go into it. It should be quite obvious from here. Okay. So that was all rather a lot. if I may say. And the thing is, can it hang together in a way that makes sense? We're hoping that Ian Watts will provide that for us in the discussion, which is only 2 pages. He says, we have here a set of highly suggestive cross-cultural symbolic similarities, all unfolding from a brute fact of nature that women periodically bleed. There are 6 of them that he details as follows. Again, they're highly suggestive cross-cultural symbolic similarities. What does it say? 1. A girl menstruates for the first time, conjuring a symbolic construct of supreme potency. 2. This construct is not something outside of herself, but her own ontological transformation into an animal, a snake or an eland, which involves acquiring male attributes, or having them from the outset in the Australian case, such as hunting prowess, for example, or capacity to turn into this animal. 3, it says transformation to the wet, as in a quality of wetness. So as in things were dry and then these seasonal rains or flooding occurs in this symbolic connection. That was 3. So 4 is she takes her kin, particularly female kin, with her, with suggestive and sometimes explicit indications of synchronous bleeding. So everyone goes together into this original time. So 5, in this other world, mundane activities like cooking or mundane states like being married are negated. So like no cooking at that particular time and no marriage at that particular time. Okay, and then number 6, periodicity is thereby established, whether seasonal or lunar periodicity, and the right way of doing things. Okay, now he draws this together into a short discussion, which basically he's going to say what the heck this all means. He says, these correspondences certainly accord with the cyclical logic outlined by Chris Knight. There is, however, a striking difference between the 2 sets of data. The myth of the Wawilak sisters sanctions the ritual practice of senior male relatives grabbing hold of boys, establishing an in-group, out-group boundary between initiated and non-initiated, and subjecting a collective of novitiates to an artificial second birth that involves inverting their ontological status, with men admitting that they stole the language of this ritual power from women. Whereas the Xam myths sanction the ritual practice of senior female relatives, grabbing hold of a girl at Menarche, establishing an in-group, out-group boundary between uterine kin and men as husbands, and inverting her and their own ontological status. The similarities suggest a common origin or process, but the opposite outcomes in terms of gender hierarchy and ritual power would seem to call for an historical explanation. What is going on here? The fundamental narrative is about women and how they are simultaneously biologically and symbolically constituted. Becoming a woman is mythologically constructed as the ultimate empowering experience, such that other culturally constructed transformations, becoming an initiated man in Australia, becoming an initiated hunter in Southern Africa, and apparently becoming a healer, are modeled on the process. Rainbow serpent type creatures provide an appropriate vehicle and logic for this narrative. And then he says, in the introduction, it was suggested on archaeological grounds alone that as some modern humans left Africa, they took with them a template of symbolic culture, which included belief in other worlds, associated the dead with game animals, the ritual practice of cosmetic skin change, and an ideology associated with blood. A more precise delineation of such a template, derived from Knight's model, was then summarized, which is what we were talking about earlier. Knight had initially tested his model against the Yolngu myth of the Wawilak sisters and their relation to Yulungu, the rainbow serpent. Barnard had Alan Barnard had proposed that such supernatural creatures presented an area of difference between Bushman and Australian indigenous beliefs, but the difference identified was quantitative rather than qualitative, begging the question of why there should be any similarity. Through a preliminary examination of the nature of the similarities, informed by Knight's model, I hope to have shown how and why they're similar. We may conjecture that something like a rainbow serpent type creature was also part of the symbolic template of early Homo sapiens, an elaboration of the logic informing the world's first metaphor, equating women's blood to the blood of game animals. So I'm going to stop there, and what I'm going to summarize at the end is just I'm trying to connect again what this means. We talked about through Chris Knight's model, which was this neo-Durkheimian sort of analysis of this analogical jump, the world's first metaphor that connects it's the as if leap, right? It's the as if that women's blood is the same as animal blood. And we're connecting like why this is. It has to do with this, well, many things. It had to do with regulation of male and female production and reproduction. It had to do with like instituting these cycles of periodicity based on the menstrual cycle and the moon cycle, and this collective ritual action. So by sort of periodically uh, inverting all these categories, particularly to do with identity, um, the culture is able to be maintained, essentially. And it seems that this, again, this connection between women's blood and the blood of animals not only introduces egalitarian practices, but is connected with rainbow serpent mythology, serpent type creatures worldwide, particularly theriomorphism, becoming like that, becoming like such creatures, allowing them to work through one, is responsible for this turning oneself into the the opposite, wrong species, wrong sex, wrong time, and um, and helping the community to access the original time, first creation, or the dreaming. Okay, that will do. I think that, thank you, Ian Watts. That was certainly fascinating. And yeah, that's enough for the moment.